Alright, hello, and welcome to another Bardic Rambling. Been a while, and I've altered things a bit, so with this being a lot higher, I can be fully in camera while sitting on a chair, or sitting on my futon, instead of sitting in that chair, which also means that if I ever get some other people to play games with me, we can all sit on the chair and play games and be recorded. But that's not what you want to be hearing, I'm thinking. Because this is the video I promised last time of the history of video games by way of TV tropes. But I'm only going to be reading the summaries and maybe a few sample games from each page, because I don't want this to go too long. I'm going to have to move the cord a little, it looks like. Anyways, on with this. So we begin with the Golden Age of video games. The period from the appearance of Space Invaders in 1978 through the great video game crash of 1983 is often known as the Golden Age of arcade games. Note, in Japan, this time period, give or take a few years, was known as the Invader Boom. When 8-bit arcade video games emerged to rule popular culture, coin-operated video arcades appeared in every shopping mall, and soon the Atari 2600 and its competitors popularized home video gaming by capitalizing on arcade ports. Back then, the titans of the arcade were longtime pinball manufacturing veterans, such as Bally, Williams Electronics, and Gottlieb. Sega was known for making arcade games, including vector games, rather than consoles, and Nintendo's Mario had never stomped on a Goomba. Creativity reigned, and a single visionary designer could still see an entire game through from concept to finished product, unlike the enormous Hollywood-style teams needed for today's AAA game franchises. Note, however, recent advances in digital distribution and the like have spurred an indie renaissance, once again allowing for very small teams to make games for profit by filling niches missed by bigger developers. Shoot-'em-ups were especially popular, as outer space and stylized spacecraft were easy to render on the crude hardware of the day. Your mileage may vary about considering this era as a true golden age, considering the fondness for games from later periods. Still, it was the first time video games hit the big time, and in terms of industry revenues, this period was one of the highest peaks the North American video game industry has ever reached to this day, and the highest overall when adjusted for inflation. So it qualifies to some extent. However, while the 1980s was the golden age for arcade games, some consider the 1990s to be the golden age for home video games. And a few of the games from the period, basically chosen at random, whichever ones pop out at me, we have The Adventures of Tron, which I'd be kind of interested in seeing what that was like, because I grew up with Tron as one of the movies that I liked to watch. So I think it'd just be interesting to see what that old arcade game looked like. Centipede, that's a classic one. Oh, there's Chuck Norris Super Kicks. Apparently he was still famous enough back in the day to get his own video game when video games were just hitting the big time. Demon Attack, Dig Dug, and Donkey Kong, those are some big ones. Randomized down to Robotron 2084. Wasn't that mentioned in Ready Player One? I'm not sure. There was Tempest, yeah. Vanguard Video Olympics. Wizard of War, spelled W-O-R. Yar's Revenge. Zaxxon. Spelled with two X's, but there's Zaxxon in the Digimon Story Cyber Sleuth I'm playing over on GameStart, which is only one X in comparison. But even some early licensed games, many of which didn't actually suck. Or actually didn't suck. 3 other Tron games, just Tron Deadly Discs, and Tron Mazatron. Yes, that last one says Tron twice. Hey kid, you gonna come up? So then we'll move on to the great video game crash of 1983. In the early 1980s, the American video game industry entered its second generation and was making money hand over fist. Arcades popped up across the country. The Atari 2600 dominated competitors in the home market, and Pac-Man fever, no relation to the same named trope, held America in its iron grip. But in 1983, something went terribly wrong. Dozens of game manufacturers and console producers went out of business. Production of new games stalled out. The American console market as a whole dried up for 2 years, and when returned, Japanese companies dominated as old American stalwarts tried to play catch-up. So what happened? The story of the great video game crash of 1983 truly begins with the downfall of Atari, a company forever linked to the crash. Atari refused to give their in-house game designers authorial credit or even royalties for their work. And initially, all games for the 2600 were developed internally at Atari because Atari thought they owned the rights to build physical cartridges for the system. All this led to a culture of dissent within Atari where many of its programmers started their own companies to make games, including physical cartridges for the 2600, of which the most successful was a nascent Activision. Atari lost its legal attempts to prevent the use of its cartridge format, I don't know where that S came from, a landmark case that had effects and reverberations in the electronics world for decades, which allowed the most creative people in the industry to directly compete with Atari's own game-making efforts. Concurrently, Atari's business strategy of sell consoles as cheaply as possible while relying on game sales to make our crazy profits made the situation worse. The strategy worked when Atari had a home market monopoly on Space Invaders and Asteroids, but when competing companies produced either better or cheaper yet comparable work, either for the 2600 itself or for rapidly emerging superior hardware, Atari's profits suffered. Also relatedly, Atari had no quality control program in place to ensure that games being sold for their console were tested for things like basic playability, or were appropriate or ready for sale at retailers. Particularly, once Activision blew the lid off the concept of making your own carts and selling them. As long as developers were willing and able, any game made for the system could be sold without Atari's approval. This resulted in a glut of games of poor quality being released shoulder to shoulder with far higher quality games at retail, some of which, such as Mystique's pornographic games, garnered enough controversy to push Atari into publicly acknowledging they had no involvement in their development, and which made finding quality software a comparative nightmare for many average casual consumers. Nintendo would take lessons from this episode years later. The company produced a number of overhyped but underdeveloped games in the late 1982 especially, including the home port of Pac-Man and the adaptation of blockbuster film E.T. the Extraterrestrial. Those two games both rushed to market as quickly as possible, E.T. being programmed in less than 6 weeks, soon earned a reputation as two of the worst games ever made. Atari also overproduced copies of these two and many others in the hopes that they would become system sellers. While initial sales were brisk, indeed record-breaking in the case of Pac-Man, word quickly spread of the poor quality and the sheer volume in which the cartridges were produced negated positive sale figures. And indeed, so many copies of E.T. were made that they outstripped the available consoles to play them on, the assumption being that it would be a brisk seller for years and drive sales for a long time to come. Stores either returned the unsellable products in droves or relegated them to clearance sections. The situation was so bad that Atari ultimately took millions of dollars worth of worthless cartridges, together with defective consoles and accessories, and buried them all in a landfill in Alamogordo, New Mexico. Further compounding the company's problems was the launch of the Atari 5200, released in November 1982. Intended to be the successor of the 2600, its lack of native backward compatibility and its notoriously finicky and fragile analog joysticks helped to doom the 5200. Although a 2600 adapter was eventually released, it was only compatible with later revisions of the 5200 console, so early adopters were still out of luck. December 7th, 1982 is the closest thing the gaming industry has to a Black Tuesday, which is not something that I'm familiar with. I'm familiar with Black Friday, being the day after Thanksgiving sale that's being moved constantly backwards into Thanksgiving because of retail. Anyways, during a shareholder meeting, Atari projected a 10 to 15% profit increase, way below the 50% people predicted Atari would announce. The stock of Warner Communications, Atari's parent company, dropped 33% the next day, and a mini scandal erupted when people discovered that the president of Atari had sold 5,000 shares of the company only a half hour before he made that fateful announcement. And there's a really big note where basically he says that he didn't, the president who sold those shares would have tried to claim innocence by way of saying that he would have sold more if he was actually selling it to get ahead of the drop in stocks. Though not a video game console, the Atari 1200 XL computer was an even bigger flop than the 5200. Excuse me, I shouldn't have done this right after I ate. Due to the desire to rush it out and retire the expensive-to-build 800. Due to all the changes made to the architecture, including unimplemented features and missing connections, the 1200X had serious compatibility issues with the 400-800 library, and was still more expensive than what the 800 was going for at the time of the 1200XL's launch. The scramble to fix the problems and relaunch the XL line, combined with Commodore's aggressive pricing on their computers, only further deepened the hole Atari was in. With its customer base eroded by what was, by 1983, inferior technology, and their profits consumed by wildly optimistic production runs, Atari racked up nearly $500 million worth of losses by the end of 1983. Of course, if it had just been Atari suffering, there wouldn't have been a real crash. But its competitors were also facing hard times. A glut of companies attempting to cash in on Atari's success gave consumers too many choices, which meant no one system could succeed in the long term because very few consumers would buy more than one. These included, amongst others, the Bally Astrocade, ColecoVision, Coleco Gemini, which has a Note standalone Atari 2600 clone similar to ColecoVision's own 2600 adapter, Emerson Arcadia 2001, Magnavox Odyssey and Odyssey Squared, the Mattel Intellivision, Vectrix Sears Telegames, also a Note. Okay, house brand that Sears sold their stuff under. And Fairchild Channel F System 2. Even so, Atari held dominance on store shelves, meaning there was little true competition, and thus several systems ended up being quickly discontinued. Even then, games released for multiple systems looked rather similar across the board, in part because Atari, Coleco, and Mattel released games for each other's consoles. The current trope image is an example of this. And I'm going to see, after a quick pause, if I can actually pull that image into the recording. So here's the pause. Okay, so that didn't quite work as I had hoped, but here's the image. As you can see, there's a whole lot of Qbert going on. Let's see if I can make this a bit bigger even. Yeah, there we go. So we got 9 different Qberts, and each one has, let's see, that's Atari 5200, TI-99 for a Commodore MC-20 Intellivision, Atari 2600. So yeah, there was a lot of it. We will then remove the image. And then I gotta scroll back down. Okay, so companies could produce games for these systems without much cost. Figuring that all video games could sell regardless of quality, poor titles from dozens of hastily created upstarts flooded the market. Non-video game companies opted to offer tie-in games as mail-in exclusives, such as Chase the Chuck Wagon by Purina and The Kool-Aid Man, though the latter was so overproduced that undistributed copies were dumped into grocery stores with a $4 price tag. As console makers and game developers went out of business, retailers had to deal with their own problem: a stockroom full of unsold products that they couldn't return. Stores offered massive discounts on this hardware in an attempt to salvage something, which caused the market for higher-priced new games to shrink in the face of large amounts of budget-priced crap. Speaking of crap, consumers had no real way to discern good games from bad ones. The internet existed only as a military and academic research project at the time, and video game magazines didn't really appear on newsstands, so most buyers only had screenshots and box text to tell them anything at all about the game. Since these almost always lied to people to get them to buy the game, consumers soon felt once bitten, twice shy. A few stores that had demo stations set up for potential consumers, but those didn't really help since they would never warn against bad or buggy games in store. So I'll skip the next few bullet points since this is getting a bit long and I've got a few more generations to go through. When the market returned to prominence in 1985, it largely rode on the success of the Nintendo Entertainment System. Whoops, I skipped a paragraph. The crash killed the American home console market for 2 years. Video game sales dropped from $3 billion in 1982, $7.23 billion in 2017 dollars, to as low as $100 million, to $41 million in 2017. In 1985, a drop-off of 97%, which caused a majority of game companies to go out of business. So then back over to the Nintendo Entertainment System, at which point the console's native Japan overtook America as a leader in the video game industry, which meant the crash never came close to killing video games as a medium. Think of the crash as a condensed version of the type of American business hubris that led to the financial meltdowns of 1929 and 2008. And a little bit now, I think. The home gaming market suffered a huge blow from the temporary death of the dedicated console, but the growing PC base, especially the Commodore 64, provided a viable replacement for game production by the small number of companies left alive. While the American arcade scene began its slow descent into obscurity, arcade games still stood near the height of their popularity. Minor arcade classics like Paperboy, Punch-Out, Space Ace, Karate Champ, and Gauntlet saw release during this period, and many of them would end up ported to home consoles, with varying degrees of success, after that market's revival. Space Ace in particular, I know quite a bit about its failed console release thanks to JonTron in his video on the game. Outside North America, though, the crash made little impact. In Europe, 8-bit home microcomputers, predominantly the Sinclair ZX Spectrum and the C64, already dominated the gaming market. An outrageous number of one-person coders wrote and released games for the far cheaper tape distribution system, which helped those machines flourish and become the backbone of Europe's gaming industry for the next decade. This is also why the NES and Master System took a lot longer to catch on in the UK than they might have. These bedroom coders received status labels ranging from Cult Hero, Jeff Minter, Matthew Smith et al., to Legend, Bell and Braben and the Oliver twins, from their fans, but that didn't prevent a number of talented developers from making enough stupid decisions to snatch defeat from the jaws of victory. Imagine Software, see here for info, which has a link, with a big example of an Orwellian editor as a bonus. So I'm not sure where that link leads to, worldofstuart.excellentcontent.com/BruceWorld, if you're interested. Even with the missteps, the European gaming industry remained solid. Nevertheless, a similar crash due to market saturation affected the home computer hardware market in the UK in 1984, causing a lot of the less popular machines like the Dragon 32 and Jupiter Ace to disappear entirely, and causing Sinclair and Acorn to be taken over by Amstrad and Olivetti, respectively. The crash had little discernible effect on the Japanese market either. Though the home of a massive arcade base that grew out of pachinko parlors and mahjong dens, Japan didn't accept home gaming consoles at first. People deemed American imports as curiosities at best. The massive discounts at which Japan forced people to sell computer technology after the crash provided the perfect storm for domestic development. And the release of the Famicom console, the MSX computer, and the SG-1000 in 1983 didn't hurt either. The Famicom and the MSX dominated the Japanese gaming industry for the rest of the decade, though the latter would soon fall to increased PC competition. And there's still a lot more paragraph there. I'm going to start skipping over. So this one sounds like a good place to pick up. Near the start of 1983, Atari had entered into the early stages of negotiating rights for the Famicom's US release, but Coleco used their port of Donkey Kong to demonstrate the capabilities of the Coleco Atom at the 1983 Summer Consumer Electronics Show. Atari interpreted this as a violation of their licensing deal with Nintendo to release Donkey Kong on home computers, and killed negotiation talks. The onset of the crash would ensure that the two companies would never get a chance to reconcile. Nintendo would end up exporting the Famicom themselves 2 years later as the Nintendo Entertainment System and achieved near monopoly status because of the American console market's weakened state. Nintendo's seal of quality system and a cartridge design that no one could manufacture without Nintendo's approval provided a degree of protection against the low-quality shovelware that plagued the Atari. To assuage concerns of American shopkeepers burned by the crash, Nintendo designed the NES with a front-loading cartridge slot to make it look more like a VCR, and bundled its largest NES set with the robotic operating buddy, Rob, and Zapper light gun peripherals, which looked much more like conventional toys. The former only worked with 2 games, and the latter didn't fare much better in the long run. But they both looked cool for the time, which was more important. So the Rob only worked with... okay, it doesn't actually lead to what those 2 games were, because that link just leads to revenue-enhancing devices. Toy stores saw through the plan, but success in test markets and a brilliant advertising strategy landed the NES space on store shelves across the country. Nintendo also had the perfect game to bundle with the NES for its 1985 American debut. A fat Italian plumber, previously known for antagonizing a giant ape, ventures across a land overrun by turtles and walking mushrooms in order to save a princess from the grasp of a dragon turtle villain. The crazy idea proved crazy enough to work, and ushered in a new era of gaming as a result. The 8-bit era of console games. The 8-bit era, or third generation, started when the great video game crash ended. During the crash, console video games fell in popularity due to all the stuff that I mentioned last time. Boosted by their domestic success, Nintendo also started eyeing the North American market, and during the summer of 1980... Oh, that's all on that last one, too. Let me pause. That looks like a good spot to open up again. What would be the killer app for the NES, however, was Super Mario Bros. The project, headed by soon-to-be legendary game designer Shigeru Miyamoto, was meant to push the Famicom, which in Japan was on the cusp of receiving a serious upgrade in the form of the Famicom Disk System, to its limits, and Miyamoto and his team put all their previous experience with developing for the console into achieving this task, and it would show, with the finished product proving to be revolutionary. Super Mario Bros. Was released in late 1985 and was by all means a genre turning point that would set the gold standard for platform games for years to come. And I recently learned from a Did You Know Gaming that it was actually partly inspired by the game Pac-Man Land. Go to Did You Know Gaming's channel for that video. I might even put a link up in the corner. On the Western market, it can be credited with re-establishing video games as an acceptable form of entertainment to a new generation. Nintendo would follow the success up with several other games that would come to define home console games from there on and forward, mainly through the release of Miyamoto-headed fantasy game The Legend of Zelda, which would come to define much of the action-adventure genre. In 1986. Later that same year, Nintendo also released the sci-fi game Metroid, which along with Konami's Castlevania, would lay the groundwork for the Metroidvania genre. Also called Igavania, because of Koji Igarashi, or would it be Igarashi Koji the proper way around? Either way, moving on. Meanwhile, back in Japan, Sega had tried challenging Nintendo with their own gaming console. The first of these was the SG-1000, which had been released on the very same day as the Famicom, but failed to make a big impact. A year later, in July 1984, Sega put out an upgraded version of the console called the SG-1002. Well, 1002nd, really. But thing first truly... Someone missed an S when they were writing this. Things first truly got interesting when the third iteration of the console, the Sega Mark III, which would be redesigned and branded as the Sega Master System for the Western market, was released in October 1985. The Master System was technically more graphically powerful than the NES, but due to Nintendo's rather iron-fisted licensing policy on the domestic market, namely that they required that games for the Famicom not to be published on other consoles, Sega faced an uphill battle from the start, despite their advantage. Inspired by Nintendo's success in the North American market, they also took the Master System to that region in September 1986 and even made an attempt at countering the popularity of Nintendo's Mario with their own mascot, Alex Kidd, thereby firing the first serious shot in the console wars between the two Japanese companies over the Western market that would really heat up throughout the later 1980s. And wow, they misspelled market too. Huh. So, Alex Kidd was apparently Sega's original mascot, but who'd even heard of Alex Kidd these days? I know this is the first time I've read the name in this context. So as for what would come to define the coming war in Nintendo and Sega's home court of Japan, though, it would be more fitting to point to the first Dragon Quest, released in 1986, and the first Phantasy Star, released in 1987, which would respectively come to form the centers of the two companies' rivalry when it came to the JRPG genre, which was just emerging in the late 1980s. And though the genre would see some degree of popularity on the Western market, it would truly come to fruition and seriously drive the Japanese market throughout much of the early to mid 1990s. It was also in this department that Final Fantasy, a project by the little-known developer Squaresoft, would make its first appearance in 1987. So we'll skip ahead a ways. This will work. As for this era, it introduced a revolutionary aspect of game design, the scroll. Throughout the golden age of video games, games either only had a single screen or flip screen gameplay, which created, respectively, a constraint in the size of a level and a disruption in the flow of the game. Scrolling graphics was a big leap in game design in that levels could now be much longer and flow a lot better than in the golden age. Also, compared to the Golden Age, sprites started to actually look like real objects, or at least cartoon objects. More colorful sprites were much more prevalent than the usually monochrome sprites in older games. Also, the backgrounds got much more colorful, whereas Golden Age games would usually have black backgrounds with little to no detail. Near the end of the 8-bit era, instead of most of the plot being described in the manual, games increasingly began experimenting with explaining the plot in-game. They already did this somewhat at the beginning, but it was often just a simple dialogue, then you were off on your adventure. Basic narrative devices such as chase scenes and different endings were starting to take root in the industry. However, because of the limited hardware at the time, full cinematics couldn't be taken care of just yet. Many of the most commercially successful video game franchises of all time debuted as part of this era. My mouse just suddenly decided to stop working. With recognizable names like Mario, Final Fantasy, Mega Man, and Sonic the Hedgehog amongst them. Now, this video's gone on for about almost a half an hour. I've only covered 3 generations of the console, or of the history of video games, of which we are approaching the 9th generation, from what I can tell. Come on. Batteries can't be dead already. I just replaced them. Did I accidentally hit airplane mode on it? Oh, there it goes. I think. Ooh. Nah. Something's rattling around in my mouse. That's weird. This was working just a bit ago. So I guess I'm going to end this episode here. I might continue with another one. We'll see. But that's this. So till the next Live Well, I hope you enjoyed. And I don't know if I'm actually going to continue this next or if I'm going to read a book. Because there is a book that I haven't read that I got from my grandpa that I might do like a chapter of. We'll see. So yeah, till the next, live well.